A couple of months, I interviewed David Coletto, who's the CEO of Abacus Data, about the how Canadians feel about various political issues. And they kind of fell out into four categories, and two of them are anxious progressives and anxious conservatives. They make up almost half of Canadians. And so I wanted to do a follow-up interview about what is making those people anxious. And so we're going to do that. Welcome to the interview, David.
Good to be here. Thanks, Markham.
This has been fascinating research. I've used it many times on social media, sort of testing it out. What do people think about it? And a lot of people agree that kind of makes sense to them. So I'll ask the question: what is making anxious progressives and anxious conservatives? What's making them anxious?
Well, I think there's two big things. There's the sort of long-term in the economy and in their lives that they look ahead and they say, I don't see a lot of opportunity in the future. They see far more risk, far more threats to their quality of life, their standard of living. So that's the big kind of existential thing that unites them. In the short term, it's the forces that we're all experiencing: rising prices, wages that are stagnant, and a sense that they're falling behind, right? That they're not able to live in the short term the kind of life, the quality of life they've come to expect. And when you look at either the progressive side of those anxious folks or the conservative side, there's not a lot of light between them. They pretty much, I don't know if they agree on that anxiety, but that anxiety is what's driving them almost equally. So it's almost entirely driven by economic anxiety. Now, what does differentiate progressive, anxious progressives and anxious conservatives is concerns about climate change. Almost universally, anxious progressives believe climate change is an emergency. I think that adds to their anxiety because they see sort of the world on fire and the future looking even more grim. For anxious conservatives, climate change isn't even an issue all that much. They may be aware of it. Some of them may be willing to admit it exists, but that's not creating any anxiety for them. Far more is an economic, but also for them more cultural. A sense that their world, not just economically but culturally, is under attack and is being threatened, and so that's adding to their anxiety. So economic anxiety underpins both groups, but then you see these kind of differentiators on climate and on cultural issues.
I want to ask you about some of the economic anxiety, and I want to take it back to the big picture, the global picture, because I recently had an opportunity to interview folks like economist Werner Antweiler from UBC, and we were talking about the long waves of innovation and how that disrupts the economy. We see it in the energy transition. We see all these new technologies. I mean, it's almost impossible to name a sector of the economy and industry that isn't being disrupted in a big way. And that always leads to disruption of people's lives. I mean, maybe they're losing their job, or maybe their, children can't find a job after going to university. I mean, there's just all of these kinds of, what role does that play in creating anxiety for these progressives and conservatives?
I think it's a big part of it. I think, that question that we ask in our surveys that I think is so indicative and actually is one of the key factors in dividing people into the groups is this notion of the future of the economy being a threat or an opportunity, right? Folks like you and I, those progressive professionals, that really tiny group that has, I think, over influence on most decisions. What distinguishes them from everybody else is their optimism. Like they see clean energy transition as something that's going to create jobs. They see, increased AI and automation in the economy as something that's going to increase productivity and wealth. But those are the tiny minority of usually higher educated folks who are feeling very secure in their jobs. They feel that they are going to take advantage. They're going to have an advantage from those innovations. But for the 50% who are anxious, they're under so much pressure, both economically, psychologically, which is really what this is. And so they just can't deal with any more change, right? The change is just overwhelming. And so they become defensive and protective of what they have, makes them small c conservatives in some way, even though many of them are progressive in their outlook. It means that change is something that causes them anxiety. And so absolutely, I think we have entered a period of time when so much of our lives, right? Think of just how much, our communication technology, the way that everyone is basically telling us we are going to have to transition. You're going to have to buy an electric vehicle at some point. You're going to have to, move away from gas in your home or using energy, because otherwise the Earth's not going to make it. That kind of disruption is very difficult for some people to deal with, because they're not very good at adapting either.
Let's talk about some of the consequences of being anxious like that. What does it make people think? And you've done some follow-up pieces on your website, abacusdata.ca, where viewers can go and delve into it in more depth. But I want to talk about a couple that really caught my eye, and they seem germane to this conversation. And one of them is 44% of Canadians believe in conspiracy theories. To me, that's astounding.
Yeah, well, I mean, they believe in a particular one that says there's a small group of elites who control the big events in the world, whether that's wars or recessions or elections, that you basically have this small group who are working against everybody else and pulling the strings to create conditions that really only benefit them. 44% of Canadians agree that happens. Another 41% think much of their lives are controlled by plots hatched in secret places, right? So imagine the World Economic Forum as an example of this idea that they are somehow conspiring against the average person to make their lives more complicated or difficult, or to force on them a lifestyle or choices that they wouldn't otherwise make. That's not an insignificant number. 44% wins you a majority government in Canada if they all were to come together and vote for one party.
I want to talk about the World Economic Forum. You're bringing that into the conversation, I think, is very indicative, because on the face of it, the facts don't support that view of the WEF. I've read, work by Klaus Schwab, the head of the World Economic Forum, and he's very much in the progressive, the positive progressive camp. But it has become a symbol. And so what it actually is irrelevant. It's become a symbol of all of those fears and the conspiracy ideas that crystallize around it.
Well, I think, part of me, and there's not been a lot of research in history, polling is a relative young science. And so we can't go back and say, is this a new phenomenon? A part of me believes there's always been conspiracy theories. There's always been people who believe there's a small group of elites or gatekeepers, as some have called them, who are pulling the strings and controlling things. I just think the extent and scale of it is growing, and the belief that it's having negative effects is real. What's driving it? Well, I think you see this kind of mentality. You see the openness to believing these things when you believe that the system is rigged, when you believe you can't get ahead, when inequality continues to rise. And when you look at the underlying attitudes of those two groups we talked about earlier, what do they both agree, whether you're on the progressive or conservative side of the spectrum? You believe that the system is rigged against you, but you believe that no matter what political leaders say, the same thing is going to happen over and over, and that inequality, especially during the pandemic, has increased, right? And so I do think that these conspiracy theories are rooted and take form and shape when people just fundamentally believe that the system is broken and it's not working for them. And then they can easily come to understand and believe that, a few dozen people have the power to, start a war or move markets that fundamentally benefit them and hurt everybody else.
Here's something that really caught my eye. 37% of Canadians think that, quote unquote, there is a group of people in this country who are trying to replace native-born Canadians with immigrants who agree with their political views, unquote. In other words, replacement theory. And Pat King of the Freedom Convoy from February is supposedly a proponent of this, and is spread. Okay, so that has nothing to do with, I would think, with anxiety about the economy or whatever. That seems to be flat out racist.
It is, and it's cultural anxiety, right? It's this idea that, particularly for white Canadians, white Americans, we see it being, advocated in the United States that they're looking for someone or groups to blame for a sense that they're losing their status. And more than a third of Canadians feel that way, particularly among those who voted or support the People's Party. It's like 72%. Like if you're a People's Party supporter, you're in a completely different world relative to everybody else. But even half the Conservatives say that they agree with that's happening. Like that white replacement is part of the overall strategy of the political class in Canada. And I do think it's not driven by economic anxiety, but it's all connected. And Frank Graves, a colleague of mine, has done lots of work in this. You've interviewed him. He's shown how sort of the open and ordered kind of perspective is also driven by this feeling of insecurity and defensiveness. So I think it's all connected, right? When we talked about economic and technological change earlier, there's also been an immense amount of social change that's happened in our country. Canada has increased its diversity significantly. Immigration's ramping up, and there are some who are willing to hook on to this idea that this diversity is part of a broader plan to change the fundamental makeup of our country, and it's being proposed and spread by those who want to seed that kind of anger and anxiety. So I do think it's tied to that broader anxiety that we talked about, particularly among more conservative elements of Canadian society.
Well, speaking of distrust, 44% of Canadians agree with the statement, much of the information we receive from news organizations is false. And as a journalist, that kind of gets under my skin. Because I mean, even in the most blatantly, in the mainstream media, there are some, I would say, fairly biased media. Nevertheless, I wouldn't say that much of their information they provide is false, flat out false. What do we make of that?
Well, I think it shows the scale and depth of the skepticism and distrust that has started to really spread. That in the midst of the pandemic, which is partly driven by this, in the midst of all that anxiety we were talking about, people are now lumping together journalists and news organizations as part of the problem, as part of, we're here talking about people who believe things that are absolutely untrue. That's what a conspiracy is. And we're going to release some new data shortly that talks more about the COVID conspiracies, which, again, shocking numbers of people believe the craziest things. But at the core, if you don't trust the news and journalism to accurately report and tell what's happening, then you're going to first turn those sources off and retreat to sources that are not telling you what's really happening, but want to engage you and want you to get excited, and not in a good way, about what's happening. And so this level of distrust, and that's true of journalism. It's even higher among governments broadly. People don't believe that governments are telling them really what's happening. And to some extent, very quickly, I think skepticism is okay. A certain level of skepticism is good for all people. But when we put the statement that most or much of the information is false, and 44% of Canadians agree, there's something driving that I think we all have to assess. And the real challenge is, how do you overcome these conspiracy theories if so many people are not going to take what the truth is at face value anymore? We don't even agree what the truth is.
Now, one of the things that I see quite a bit, and in our community, we have a lot of these folks who are, they were in the sympathy freedom convoys back in February, March. They run around with, a couple of Canadian flags streaming from their pickup truck or their, that seems to be the symbol. But your responses show that most Canadians, like a very large majority of Canadians, actually think Canada is a very free country. Maybe in a big proportion think it's the most free country.
Yeah, we did in response to Mr. Poilievre's claim that he's going to make Canada the freest. We wanted to assess, do Canadians think we're free? And most do. We're not the freest, and I think we still have work to do. And that also might be some Canadian modesty at play. But there are very few Canadians out there who say, I can't live the life that I want because of some restrictions on it, or I'm not free enough to live the way that I want. The vast majority of Canadians recognize that we live in one of the freest countries in the world and that we have an immense amount of freedom to make choices. Sure, there are things we cannot do, but we all agree that we will, try to drive the speed limit. We'll stop at red lights because that's the right thing to do. We'll wear a mask when we're asked to because it's protecting other people. But a small minority, a very small minority, don't feel that way, and they seemingly are the loudest voices right now. And that is, again, part of this narrative. But despite the fact that there's this trust, I still look at the data and see that most Canadians recognize that we're actually really fortunate to live in Canada. And there are very few countries around the world that we can point to and say, I'd rather live there. I'd rather have what they have. And so it's always useful to remind ourselves of that. And that's partly why we wanted to do this research, was to give a collective sense of how we're feeling.
Well, on that positive note, I will end the interview. Thank you very much, David. Always appreciate your insights.
Thanks, Markham. Take care.